it was the pilot's fault or that it was an intended murder-suicide is just so far beyond my comprehension that I think it's malicious and it's wrong. It was negligence. It was incomprehensible negligence and almost criminal negligence, probably it could be. It showed the aircraft reaching Agari, the point where it should have transferred to Vietnamese airspace, and it took action. It turned in such a way and headed back directly toward Penang. His words essentially were, paraphrased, if I had sent up a fighter plane that night and it had shot it down, I'd be in more trouble than I am now. That's what he said. 17 minutes later, the Vietnamese controller calls the people in Kuala Lumpur and says, what's happened to an MH370? It hasn't transferred yet. 15 minutes later than he should have made that call. I think he was fighting to save his aircraft, which would explain the erratic movements and actions of the aircraft on its track. My issue is entirely that there's been so much speculation, so much misinformation presented right from day one. A level of secrecy has been put over the actual incident at the time and the subsequent hours following the turnaround at Agari.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our audience from around the globe. This is your host, Sid. To our new subscribers, welcome to the fold. And to our returning subscribers and listeners, it's wonderful to have you back with us for another episode of Sit Down with Sid podcast, where we bring people together one conversation at a time. A quick note before we begin. MH370 remains a complex mystery with many conflicting theories. The views expressed by our guests are their own. Our goal as a channel is to provide a platform for various perspectives as we continue to piece together the story. Joining us today is Captain Desmond Ross, a veteran pilot and an aviation expert with over 40 years of experience. From the cockpit to the highest levels of aviation security and regulation, Captain Ross offers a rare 360-degree view of where the global aviation system succeeds and where it fails. A steadfast voice in the search for MH370, he has spent years advocating for transparency and a deeper investigation into the human and technical factors of that night. Captain Ross, it is a profound honor for us to have you here, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sid. A pleasure.
Thank you. Okay, Captain Ross, let's get into this. So you have stated that if standard protocols had been followed from day one, MH370 would have been found immediately. Is it your view that this global mystery is actually a byproduct of administrative negligence rather than a technical impossibility?
I totally do. Whatever happened on the flight deck of MH370 that night is a complete mystery at this point in time. I've said it before, I'll say it now again. Anyone who says they know what happened is talking through their hat. They have no idea what happened. And that's the sad reality, that until such time as we can locate a wreckage of some sort, and it's going to be very difficult to probably get data from the flight data recorder or the cockpit voice recorder at this point in time after so long, but it's not impossible. Those devices are actually made to withstand high temperatures, crash conditions, all sorts of things, and it's just possible that we might still get some data from it. But at the very minimum, we'll at least be able to see whether there's been a fire on board. There's still a good chance, even if it's at the bottom of the ocean, that we could see all of that sort of stuff. My issue is entirely that there's been so much speculation, so much misinformation presented right from day one, and I think a level of secrecy has been put over the actual incident at the time and the subsequent hours following the turnaround at Agari, the checkpoint where it was supposed to cross into Vietnamese airspace. At that point, all I can say is that the actions shown later, 4 days later, by the military on their military radar recordings, which I'll come back to this point, it's quite different from the civil radar systems. The military radar can track a object without it transponding, without it having a transmitter on board sending out a signal, which the civil aircraft have. So the military track, and I did see the original recording of that. It showed the aircraft reaching Agari, the point where it should have transferred to Vietnamese airspace, and it took action. It turned in such a way and headed back directly toward Penang, which was the nearest large airport that could handle an emergency. It did what any experienced captain would do in the event of an emergency. He was clearly, in my view, that showed that he was trying to save his aircraft. He was trying to turn around, head toward a major airport, the nearest airport that he could land at, and descend to it. Something happened from that moment right through to the end that we don't know about. If the correct procedures had followed, and the correct procedures are written in documents that every commercial pilot has read, every commercial pilot, right down to the guys flying small Cessnas around the bush, they have read and understand what would happen in the event of an unknown aircraft entering military airspace, behaving erratically, and they would expect the authorities controlling that airspace to react in a certain way. None of that happened. None of that happened that night. Yet the military state that they were tracking, and they showed it on the radar, they were tracking an unidentified aircraft coming down from Agari, the checkpoint, heading toward Butterworth Airport, Penang, which is the most sensitive military installation in that part of the world. It's also the home of the Five Eyes security group that's been set up ever since the Malaysian emergency. And it's a highly sensitive, secure facility. Nobody should have thought that this unidentified aircraft was just an airplane. Don't worry about it. It could have posed a threat to that highly sensitive security facility. It could have posed a threat to the Malaysian Air Force headquarter facility, which is also at Penang. All of these things are just, to me, mind-blowingly obvious that whatever, I mean, the Malaysian authorities at the time said there were exercises in progress, so there were some security issues that they were concerned about, and they didn't want to reveal that they had seen this aircraft and had tracked it, which is why it took, 4 days before the information started to leak out. But there's more than that. The aircraft, on reaching the boundary of airspace between Malaysia and Vietnam at the point called Agari, it was told to transfer radio transmissions, communications from Malaysia from Kuala Lumpur center to Ho Chi Minh. Normal procedure, absolutely nothing unusual about all of that. That is what happens. In every flight, whenever you're crossing one boundary to another, you're given an instruction to transfer to the new control area. That should be done, again, according to the books and in all known publications that everybody knows about and everybody reads and is trained in when they're learning how to fly, and especially when they become a captain of a large aircraft. That is supposed to occur within 2 minutes of the instruction of reaching the transfer point. 17 minutes later, the Vietnamese controller calls the people in Kuala Lumpur and says, what's happened to MH370? It hasn't transferred yet. 15 minutes later than he should have made that call. 15 minutes. That's a long time when you're traveling at Mach 0.8, which the aircraft was doing. It's a long, long time, and you travel a long, long way. The Vietnamese controller did nothing. He sat there on his thumb, wondering, some MH370 is going to call me, but it didn't. It never called him, in fact. but he should have been inquiring about it. He should have gone back to KL and said, didn't get the call from MH370 within the 2-minute time frame. Can you check? He eventually did that, and guess what? The controller who had been on duty had gone home. He was in bed sleeping, or on his way home to go to bed sleeping. It was a shift transfer. He had not even briefed his replacement who was coming on for the night. They had to make a phone call to find out what had occurred. The controllers in the Kuala Lumpur control center had to make a telephone call to the fellow who had departed, was on his way home, or maybe already home, and they had to get him to brief them on what the circumstances were at the time, which was pretty straightforward. I mean, there wasn't much to say, except the aircraft had been told to transfer. So it was all done. It was no longer Kuala Lumpur's responsibility. It was now Ho Chi Minh City. No one did anything that was correct on that particular occasion. Even the KL controller has a certain tacit responsibility to ensure that the transfer occurs. It's a little bit vague in terms of the book responsibility, but any responsible controller you would expect would watch his aircraft transfer over to the next sector and say, all done, move on, next job. He didn't even do that. He got up and he went home and didn't even tell his replacement what was happening. So there's, in my view, culpable responsibility on both sides, KL and on Vietnam, particularly the Vietnamese controller. The fact that he didn't take the actions he was supposed to take meant that the aircraft was already halfway back to Penang, according to the military radar trace, and that's pretty clear. Had they reacted, had the military, now we move over to the military, the Royal Malaysian Air Force, had they reacted according to the aforementioned instructions that are written and that every pilot reads and understands, they should have started calling. They should have started making inquiries, calling on the radio, on non-aircraft, whatever. They should have also immediately picked up the telephone from the military controller to the civil controller in the Kuala Lumpur area control center and said, do you have an aircraft that it has strayed off course? Or do you have any idea who this aircraft is that's coming down here? We're not absolutely certain whether that happened or not, because it's not really been discussed. It would be known whether it happened or not, because all of these things are recorded. Absolutely everything that takes place in the operational environment, with air traffic control, with pilots, between the controllers, any phone calls in and out of the center that are operationally relevant, they are all recorded. So everything would be available for inspection and should have been read by and understood by the investigators subsequently. So there's a lot of questions that are still to this day not clearly answered and not in the public domain. Why did the military allow this aircraft, which they said themselves was behaving erratically? It had apparently started the turn. It had turned, when it was heading up, it had started a right-hand turn, then a left-hand turn and bank and turned back and headed back on a reciprocal course. Well, not quite a reciprocal course. It was heading for Penang, not for Kuala Lumpur. And it also started to change altitude. It went up, it went down. If it wasn't so serious, it's laughable, because to say that that aircraft did not pose a threat, was of no risk or concern to the Malaysian controllers in the military center, it's just ridiculous. It was behaving erratically. You would immediately think, what's going on here? And if you can't contact it by radio, then the next action is to send up an interceptor aircraft, a fighter plane, not to shoot it down, not to take any military action that could be mistaken or, later become a major problem. It's all about the two eyes of the pilot. His job is to fly up alongside this moving target, look at it, and tell people what he sees on the radio. He would have seen MH370, Malaysian airline colors. He would have recognized it. He would have known what it was. He would not have shot it down. There was never any question of that, despite what the acting Minister of Defense said that night on a couple of days later on a BBC interview that I watched. I've still got a recording somewhere. he said, I didn't send up an aircraft. His words essentially were, paraphrased, if I had sent up a fighter plane that night and it had shot it down, I'd be in more trouble than I am now. That's what he said. Um, and yes, he would have been in more trouble than he was then, but not much more trouble because the people still died. And it was negligence. It was in incomprehensible negligence, and almost criminal negligence. Probably it could be that none of these actions were properly performed. Now, eventually, the aircraft was tracked again on military radar past Penang and Butterworth Air Base, all of that stuff. It flew past them, and still no one is trying to establish exactly who it was. They could have easily sent up an aircraft from Butterworth. You know, he flew over the airport or close to it. Why did they not do that? The whole scenario just seems immensely strange. And that there's that period of, as I've said many times, about 4 hours during which the whole problem could have been solved then. We may not have saved the people. We may not have prevented a crash, but we would not still be looking for it 12 years later or whatever it is. There may have been a way to avoid the loss of life. You don't know that. We'll never will know that. But if an aircraft had gone up, looked at it, the pilot had recognized it and said, this is the Malaysian aircraft that's missing. There were all sorts of other options open at that point, but that never happened. So why did that not happen? No one has ever answered that question. And when I ask it, I usually get ignored. So I expect I will be again. That's about where I come in on all of this. To suggest, as several people have done, that, it was the pilot's fault or that it was an intended murder-suicide is just so far beyond my comprehension that I think it's malicious and it's wrong. I don't think so. I think that I'm sorry, uh,
Zahari, Captain Zahari.
Captain Harry, yes. I think he was fighting to save his aircraft, which would explain the erratic movements and actions of the aircraft on its track. I'm still of the view that something catastrophic happened on the flight deck, causing the aircraft to become difficult to control, or that in fact the pilots were both incapacitated, maybe even dead, and somebody who was not skilled at doing the job was trying to fly the aircraft. I don't know. None of us will know. And anyone that says that they do know is fantasizing. I'll stop for a moment.
Wow. Few things that stood out is, and I wanted to bring this up, but thank you for already sharing it, is the 17-minute delay, the 15-minute delay from the Vietnamese controller. As you said, the standard is the 2 minute, and he reached out 15 minutes later, which is a total time of 17 minutes. And then the second was the acting defense minister's statement, and I had that actually, I wanted to bring it up, is he did not want to send an interceptor to shoot down a civilian plane, you know? So, I mean, you're looking just not at the fault of the Malaysian authorities here, you're also looking at the lack of accountability from the Vietnamese side as well.
I agree. And there's been very little said about that. Well, I don't know if it even got very much coverage in the Vietnamese media, but we've certainly read very little about it or what they might have said. I'm not aware of a real investigation having taken place in Vietnam. Of course, there was an investigation that was led by the Australians, or at least the search was led by the Australians, but I do not, unfortunately, have the full details of the subsequent accident investigation that would have been held and properly documented by the Malaysian authorities. But even if it has been, I'm afraid that the whole credibility of the Malaysian authorities was shot on that night. And whatever is written in their final report, I think is probably open to question. And I would certainly question quite a lot of whatever is written in there. And I haven't actually read the full document. I've read parts of it. And I simply can't agree with the segments that relate to Captain Hadari being the culprit. I mean, the nonsense about him having a flight simulator, so what? I've got a flight simulator. Just about every professional pilot in the business these days has a flight simulator at home. Um, and they are actually approved by many of the civil aviation authorities. I won't say all of them, but they're actually approved by Australia, for example, and the UK, here in Ireland, I think, where the pilot can sit at home and actually do some training, which is authorized as training experience, and it can be logged and used to show that you've practiced certain instrument approaches or actions using a flight simulator. The flight simulator you're using has to be approved by the Civil Aviation Authority prior to doing this. But in the case of Captain Hadari, I'm absolutely sure it would have been. And I mean, he himself was a senior check pilot in any case. But the fact that he had a flight simulator is not even remotely a pointer toward him planning a major disaster such as this one. It should have been discarded as okay, they did what they did. They looked at it and they say that there was a flight planned within his flight simulator, which was very similar to the one to the final flight. Maybe, maybe not. I've just got so many questions that honestly, even if somebody wanted to talk about it now, they couldn't give me the clear answer because firstly, it's a bit long ago, and people's memories start to fade a little bit. But because we still do not have the actual flight data recorder and the actual cockpit voice recorder until or such time as those items are found, and we are certain that you can't get any information from it. I think it's still an open question. I think that excuse me, it was such a pity that they weren't found at the time while the locator beacon was still beeping. But there are so many silly stories surrounding all of that as well. There was a military aircraft out on a search, and they thought that they detected the signal from one of the locators. Turned out to be a onboard warning on that aircraft of a faulty toilet that made the same sound, but it was actually on the aircraft. It wasn't even in the ocean. We don't know what the motivation was for the recent search. They were so convinced that they knew where to look. They went out and they looked. They found nothing again. I personally do not think anyone is searching in the right area. And again, that's very much a gut feeling. It's a gut feeling born of experience and having engaged in a number of searches over my career. As a helicopter pilot as well as a fixed wing pilot, I've spent quite a lot of time searching and looking for people in helicopters. And in every case, there's certain protocols you follow. You start at the point where you last knew the aircraft was located, where it definitely was located. The last fixed position you had, and you work from there. Well, even that didn't really happen satisfactorily. They did search in the South China Sea to a degree, but that only lasted a couple of days, and they moved away to a fanciful point in the Southern Ocean, which even Inmarsat, the people who calculated, who developed the algorithm, the mathematical calculation that said it should be on these arcs. This is where it ends up, and they started to narrow an area in the South China Sea, in the Southern Ocean, in fact. And even Inmarsat said, this is experimental. This has never been done before. It was done as an exercise by one of their programmers who thought, let's have a look, see what we can work out here. Great. Good mathematical calculation. Helpful? Don't know. Because it directed people to something that even they say was not reliable. You'll find that on record. Inmarsat themselves said it wasn't a reliable, known method of finding the aircraft. It was an experiment. It had never been done before. But it became the Holy Grail. And everybody said, it's on one of these arcs. We've got to search around here. That flies in the face of other things that, of course, we've seen. The comments by the guy on the oil rig who said he saw an aircraft that appeared to be in trouble fly over him in roughly the right area. A lady on a boat, a fisherman on a fishing boat, people on an island who said they saw a flaming aircraft in the sky, all to the north, heading out into the toward the mainlands of Southeast Asia. And I would not be even a little bit surprised to wake up one morning and hear somebody say they found MH370 in the jungles. It crashed in the jungle and it's there, burnt and destroyed, but at least we know where it is. I wouldn't be at all surprised. The various other theories that have come up over the last few years and months, even quite recently, last year, other methods of trying to figure out where it might be because of I am definitely not a communications specialist when it comes to HF radios and all of that sort of stuff. I've used them. Of course, I have as a pilot, and particularly years ago when we didn't have all the satellite communications. But to be able to, I just have difficulty when somebody tells me that they've gone back through the records and they found signal data that suggests the aircraft may be in this area or that area. Really? After this length of time, that they can find data and come up with these calculations saying, yet it's given airtime, it's written up in newspapers and magazines, and ships go searching in those areas. I think the one thing that's probably come out of all of this is a massively valuable, probably, piece of ocean floor mapping. There's a large area of the Southern Ocean which is now mapped very accurately by the ships and the drones, the marine drones that have been out there. And that'll be worth a fortune to people in some time in the future. And maybe that's why they did that. But, I'm sorry to say it, both to the relatives and friends of the missing people, that there's so much stuff there that just doesn't bear consideration, in my view. The thing about the pieces of aircraft, that part of it, the pieces of aircraft that have washed up on beaches, that also fits to a degree with my own theory because it's all in the northern side of the search area. None of those pieces of wing flap material from the aircraft, none of it was found on the southern coasts of Australia or even on any of the islands that are down around that way. It's all been found up there around Reunion Island and various other locations, which again makes me wonder if that aircraft had in fact headed over the people who said they saw something in the sky. 4 different eyewitness reports that night that have been discounted. If I had the money and I was in charge of such a search, I would have people go there and interview them. Maybe they did that, but whatever they've said or whatever has happened, their reports have been discounted. I have enough faith in human nature to think that people would not report a flaming aircraft flying over them unless it was pretty real, or unless they drunk 10 bottles of whiskey or something. It doesn't fit. And that there were 4 reports, not just one, but 4 that night. An oil rig worker, a fishing boat, a lady on a sailboat, and the other one. But I think you get my point that the authorities have told these 4 eyewitness reports, and the oil rig worker apparently got fired not long afterwards. Why was that? Um, it's one of the great mysteries of our times, and I sincerely hope that it's going to be resolved at some point in some way. I might say that I've got plenty of respect for the Australian guys who were actually running the search and rescue effort, the entire search. I know some of them, and I've seen what they were doing. And I saw what the Royal Australian Air Force was doing with its aircraft out over the area searching. And everything is highly professional. It was professional. It was being done in the best of faith and as professionally as was possible with the information that they had to hand. I come back to what I said earlier. The whole idea that people started to focus on this location in the Southern Ocean because of a calculation done on an almost amateur basis by a professional guy, an Inmarsat, who thought he was doing the right thing to help. He had an idea, he thought this would work, and he came up with a formula. But there is absolutely nothing to say that this was infallible. It's not. He said it's not infallible. So I don't know. The other aspect to all of that Southern Ocean stuff is the simple fact that it's one of the most inhospitable parts of the entire world. I've been there. I was the helicopter pilot on an Australian vessel that went to Heard and McDonald Islands in 1980. It's a while ago now, but I flew right through that area, and our ship uh, sailed through that area, pretty much over the top of the area, right through the area that they're doing the search. We went from Perth to Heard Island, straight line, basically. It goes through the location that they've been searching. Mountainous waves, if not every day, every other day. And our ship at one point was like a submarine, rising and falling, going through green water and coming back up again. It was incredible. No aircraft could have survived more than 24 hours in those sorts of waters. I doubt that he would even have been able to make any form of a landing. It would have been a crash, and it would have broken up straight away if it did. If that's what he did, it would have just broken up. If not immediately, then within 24 to 48 hours, it would have been just shredded at the bottom of the ocean. To even suggest that they're going to find a full aircraft at the bottom of that ocean, which is what the explorers were looking for just recently, is just not feasible. If the aircraft is in that area, it'll be in pieces. Those pieces, could they get to Reunion Island and all those other locations? Yes, there's been all sorts of marine studies of currents, and some of them are saying that yes, it is possible that the currents could have swept them up and into those northern areas. But as I keep coming back to it and saying it's also highly possible that the aircraft was in fact spotted by these four people, and their reports discarded, and that it did in fact end up crashing in that location, close to Reunion Island and close to the Malaysian mainland and the Southeast Asian mainlands. I've just I've reached a point, I think, where everything that is said to me about new theories and so forth is just publicity seeking, and people. It's why I've been fairly silent on the subject for the last few years, because I just can't see the credibility of some of the stuff that is being thrown out there at the moment, which is very sad. I mean, we all want to find it. We do. Everyone wants to find it. I just feel that they're looking in the wrong area, and millions of dollars have been spent in the wrong area. Ask me a question, Sid.
No, thank you so much. I mean, you have answered a lot of things I wanted to ask. So let me ask you now. I know you mentioned about the Flaperon and the parts that were found by Blaine Gibson himself, who we had the honor of having him on the show.
Mhm.
What does that physical wreckage tell you about the state of the aircraft at the end of the flight? Was it a high-speed dive, or a controlled glide, in your opinion?
Look, if the aircraft was being controlled by a pilot at the time and he'd run out of fuel, and look, let's go back a step. You know, if he was really going to commit a murder-suicide, why bother? Just stick the nose into the water and it's all over. What is exactly what sort of mindset would say, let's land smoothly and hope that everybody survives? They've got no chance of survival anyway. Not in that freezing water and 50-foot waves, and they're not going to survive anyway, even if the aircraft did not break up. If the pilots were incapacitated and it was not being flown by a skilled pilot, if it in fact was still on autopilot in some way, which is possible because the rat was out and it would have been generating enough electricity probably to keep at least some of the instruments operating and maybe the autopilot. But if it was simply gliding down and ended up in the water, it would have broken up. It would not have survived. Even a fairly flat landing, it would still have broken up soon thereafter with the waves and the movement of the aircraft. The wings would have started to shred. The parts that I've seen in photographs, I've not actually held or touched any of them. They could be from the aircraft. There's no doubt. And some of them were definitely 777 parts. But were they from that aircraft? We have reports that they found some serial numbers and indications that yes, they were from MH370. But you know, we also have speculation that some of those parts were planted, and some of them might have been even put there for publicity purposes, whatever. I tend to think that some of them are actually from MH370, but not from the Southern Ocean. I'm sorry, everybody that's watching. I still call me old-fashioned, but you know, I think that some of this, the histrionics around all of this, are just fantastic fiction. And I think that if we really seriously put our minds to it and spent the amount of money that has been spent, that a search in the northern areas and even in the jungles, some of which are pretty hard to get to, could still yield some results. Look, there are parts of those jungle areas where people simply don't go. I'm very familiar with Papua New Guinea, not so much with the Malaysian highlands, but in those areas, but it's similar terrain, similar very thick jungle, triple canopy jungle. You know, an aircraft crashes, it goes through the top level, the bottom level. By the time it hits the ground, there's no trace of even a crash site. The aircraft has gone in and it's landed at the bottom of the 100-foot high trees, etc. And they are still to this day finding wreckages from the Second World War, 80-odd years ago. They are still finding unknown crash sites in Papua New Guinea, similar terrain, and to that in Malaysia. The possibility still remains that one of these days there'll be an explorer or just a village person, somebody going about their daily business, will break through a piece of forest that they haven't looked at before, and there it'll be. You know, that is a possibility. You can't deny it. I'm afraid I wasn't happy at the time. I'm still not happy with some of the individuals who started to espouse their theories about what happened and how the pilot did it, etc. I just don't accept most of that, I'm afraid. There have been pilot suicides. There's the most famous one, I suppose, in Germany, where that German wings guy flew into the side of a mountain. Pretty hard to deny that that wasn't deliberate, but that's something different. There was another one in Indonesia some years ago in Sumatra, if I remember correctly, where the pilot, again, the captain had been locked out of the flight deck and the co-pilot dove it straight into a river. So you can't deny that these things happen. But the information surrounding Captain Hadari and his co-pilot and all the other people, it just doesn't fit. It doesn't relate to the sorts of circumstances that the others were in. The German wings pilot was known to have a history of mental illness, which had not been reported to the airline, which is most unfortunate in that incident. If the doctor had reported the information to the airline, he probably would have been grounded and never had the opportunity to do what he did. In this case of MH370, there is no such background information. Both pilots had normal lives. They had no financial problems. They had families. They were well regarded by the airline, by their peers. Just doesn't fit. And I personally just reject the idea that it was a pilot suicide in this instance. Anyone claims that it definitely was is it's just speculation, nothing else.
Wow. Captain Ross, I have a couple of more questions before we wrap this up. Okay. Now, if there was an intruder, or even if there was a fire in the E&E bay, based on your experience, how would that change the cockpit's ability to communicate at that time?
Well, first of all, I'm not rated on that type of aircraft, so I'm not entirely familiar with the arrangements, but I do know that the floor that opens, so the trapdoor that opens is is outside the flight deck, and you can get down in there. So there is, and it's been said a number of times, I think, excuse me, there is a possibility that somebody could have gained access to that bay without the knowledge of the pilots on the flight deck. But to achieve that, they would have had to overcome the cabin crew. Because I don't think any member of the cabin crew would have allowed anyone to open that and access it during the flight without resisting. So that leads us back to the idea of a hijack. If that did occur. Yes, if they got down there, it's been acknowledged that they could interfere with the flight controls of the aircraft, certainly with the navigation systems and all else. At one point, there was some silly speculation that somebody could have plugged into the entertainment system at the back of the aircraft in the passenger cabin and taken control of the aircraft. That has been disproved, I think, as being totally not practicable, not possible. The idea that somebody could have taken over actually taken over control of the aircraft in the electronics bay is also not really practicable, because I think it's been shown by the electricians and the navigation specialists, no, you couldn't actually control the aircraft from there. You could interfere with the control of the aircraft, but you could not actually control it from there. That requires other flight data and information on the flight deck, including control of the engines, which is not, to the best of my knowledge, actually available in that electronics bay. So again, yes, getting in there would interfere and it could cause problems. If somebody got in there, or if some piece of electronic equipment in there exploded and caused a fire, then you start to have a different scenario where smoke starts to fill the cockpit and the cabin itself. The air conditioning could have gone off, the pressurization system could have gone off. The idea that the captain could have put on his oxygen mask and then turned off the pressurization system so that all the passengers behind him and the cabin crew would have died of asphyxiation. That's a possibility, but again, it doesn't fit with any sensible logic. If he's already killed everybody in the aircraft and he wants to commit suicide, just drive the aircraft into the ground. I mean, there's just no sensibility in any of this. That some of the theories that are out there are just, to my way of thinking, insane. Mind you, there's lots of things that are out there at the moment that are insane, including some of the stuff that's happening in the Middle East right now. But that's another subject, I guess. But, so people can be insane and people can do crazy things. But to my way of thinking, that night, there were two professional pilots on the flight deck. There was a professional cabin crew in the back of the aircraft. And my logic says something catastrophic occurred just at that point where they were about to transfer from Kuala Lumpur control to Ho Chi Minh control at Gary, the reporting point known as Gary. Something happened. And at that point, the flight crew were fighting to save their aircraft. So they turned around and headed back toward Butterworth, toward Penang, in the hope that they could make a safe landing. Something then happened that they were unable to achieve that, and the aircraft kept on flying, which at that point suggests to me that it was not really under proper control. I mean, we also, somebody else recently wrote up a piece that I read about how it had to be a highly skilled pilot operating because he flew along the boundaries of the flight information region, and in doing so, avoided being in one or the other, and people either ignored it or didn't actually pick him up on radar. Sorry, doesn't gel. It's just nonsense. Again, I come back to the military radars, which not only Malaysian military radar, but also Thai radar said that they had some unidentified aircraft. No one has told us what the top secret was that prevented the military from talking about this at the time when it happened. The Malaysian government have made statements that because of security concerns, they couldn't make this announcement for the 3 or 4 days before they did. So what was the secret? What was the military activity that was taking place? I think it's time that they told us because it's no longer important. They could tell us what that military secret was. Why was it so imperative? And I didn't say earlier, but there's another simple part of that as well that was totally, to my incomprehensible to me and criminally negligent. The standard procedure also in such a case of an unidentified aircraft entering your airspace is to coordinate, talk to each other, see if somebody else knows what's happening. It was in the military airspace. The military controller was watching it. The military controller should have said, he should have picked up his phone to his civil counterpart and said, I've got an unidentified aircraft. Do you have an aircraft that might fit with us? If the civil controller was on top of his game, he would have said, I've just lost MH370. It was supposed to go to Vietnam and we can't find it. Maybe it's that. Simple logic. And in a conversation between the two of them, they could have worked out what it was. But that, again, apparently didn't happen. The civil controller also should have used all the possible range of options. He should have picked up his phone, even if the military controller had not called him. He should have picked up his phone to the military controller and said, I've lost an aircraft. Do you have anything in your airspace that you don't understand? The military controller would have said, yes, actually I do. There's an aircraft tracking down here, but it's not going to China. It's coming back this way. But they would have, simple logic, they would have worked it out. They would have figured out that something has gone wrong and that's the aircraft. They didn't even actually need to send up an interceptor at the beginning. That would have been the first procedure, would have been that conversation between the military controller and the civil controller. Then the next option is to send up the interceptor to have a look, just a simple look out of the fighter aircraft's cockpit. You would have seen if there was anybody on the flight deck. You would have seen if there were lights glowing in the civil cockpit on the flight deck. That to me is the crucial issue which no one seems to want to talk about. Why weren't all the correct procedures followed? It's not, rocket science. You don't need to be a brain surgeon or anything like it. It's all written down. A, B, C, D, E. This is what you do. But it wasn't followed. Why not? We would not be having this conversation now if it had been followed, because they would know exactly, the ultimate situation there would have been that they could have possibly found some way to save the aircraft. It might have been pretty damn difficult, especially if the flight crew were incapacitated. But they could have followed the aircraft, seen where it ended up, and then gone straight in with a rescue effort. All of that was doable. It was practical. Didn't happen.
Uh, uh, Captain Ross, two more things. I want to talk about Ocean Infinity. Since 2014, with the ongoing and outgoing search efforts taken by them, covering over or close to 200,000 square kilometers, if I'm not mistaken. The current search concluded March 8th of this year, and nothing has been found till date. Do you think, as you had mentioned, is it that they're looking at the wrong place, or is it that they also don't have the correct information or are being misled by the report or by the data that has been fed to them by the authorities?
Well, I go back to what I said at the beginning. I think they're looking in the wrong place. I don't think it's anywhere near the Southern Ocean. I think the aircraft, if it is ever found, will be found in the northern part. But that's only my opinion. Um, I Somebody was convinced, both in the Malaysian government and with the ocean searchers, that it was worth doing, as they have, as you rightly said. I mean, they've spent millions of dollars on all of this. And what I said earlier, one thing that comes out of it is that they've now got very good maps of the seabed in that region, which they've never had before. That in itself could well be worth millions and millions of dollars in future oil search or any other sorts of activities that might take place. But and certainly of any missing ships or anything else that could occur. But were they searchers being misled? It's an open question, isn't it? Prefer they search there than search up here. What I said a moment ago, what was the secret they were guarding? Why couldn't they have told the searchers when the aircraft was lost that they'd been watching, the military had been watching it on radar? They must have figured out by then what it was that they'd been watching. And they didn't know, even if they couldn't work out what it was for the first few hours while they tracked it from Igari back down over Butterworth and then out to the west. Even if then they didn't know what it was, surely after all the publicity, within 24 hours, they would have worked out what it was. I firmly believe they had, but they still didn't tell us why they couldn't have provided that information at the beginning. So there is a conspiracy theory that's open for consideration. We've heard all the other conspiracy theories of super secret equipment on board the aircraft that had to be destroyed and couldn't possibly get to China. So, any other conspiracy theory is probably just as valid as the other ones that we've heard. I don't like conspiracy theories, but lots of people do. Keeps them amused, awake at nights maybe. But I prefer to try and deal with facts, and the facts that are known to us at the moment are inconclusive. And you've got to feel for the families. And therein is another issue as well. The way in which the families were treated over the days and weeks following the disappearance of the aircraft, I think was absolutely shocking. I think it was very poor from the Malaysian Airlines management perspective. I don't think they did the right thing by the people. I don't think the government or the police authorities did the right thing by the people. For heaven's sake, these were ordinary people whose families had gone missing. And some of them were being treated almost like criminals because they really wanted information. in defense of the authorities and of the Malaysian Airlines people, they didn't really have that information to give them. But I think they could have handled the whole thing in a much, much better way. I actually know a couple of Malaysian Airlines people who resigned soon thereafter because they were equally disgusted by the way in which it had been handled. It just wasn't, humane and properly in consideration of the distress under which the relatives and passengers' friends that they were under at that point. So there were so many things that were not done well, and touch wood, it doesn't happen again. But in the event that something like this does ever occur again, the important thing is to learn. No, excuse me. The important thing is to learn lessons from it and try to ensure that if any such event ever does occur, that there's a protocol there that would prevent as much distress as this one did cause. There has to be a protocol also for, I think, wider discussion of the incident. And when things are changing so rapidly, as we both know, and everybody knows in the world of communications these days, just then, even then, only a few years ago, we didn't have this level of communication, the internet, all the information that's around. Photographs are up and on the internet within seconds of an actual occurrence. It's hard to see that such, in fact, I would say that such an event as MH370 could not occur again because we now have satellite communications across great widths of ocean. We did not have them then. Excuse me. Air traffic services is rapidly evolving. Air traffic control is rapidly evolving such that we can now track aircraft almost anywhere in the world. Not everywhere, but almost anywhere in the world. Across the great expanses of the Pacific Ocean, we've now got look-down satellites. Instead of radar, as you know, it's got limited range, 150 to 300 nautical miles at best over flat terrain. But as soon as a mountain gets in the way, radar doesn't work, which is the case, in Southeast Asia. There's lots of mountains. Over the ocean, it'll extend much further. The look-down systems, what's called ADS-B systems from space, now mean that had this occurred in the last week or so, somebody would have been watching MH370 move across the ocean, because that system is now available. And it's only going to get better as we move forward. Over the next few years, there are additional systems going up so that aircraft with or without transponders it will still be possible to track them. So that sort of thing should never happen again. It may do, but it shouldn't. And these things can always happen where the human element is involved. The sad truth of the matter is that we have systems these days which are highly reliable, and the least reliable component in the chain of events is the human element. That's where it breaks down so often. There are exceptions to the rule. And do not ever ask me to get onto an airliner where there are no pilots. That is not going to happen in my lifetime, I hope. There will always be a pilot on the flight deck. And some people use events such as this to say that we should do away with pilots, have the aircraft controlled totally by computers. Sorry, I'm not a believer in that one. And a classic example is the right there in New York where you are, in the Sullenbergers landing on the Hudson a few years ago. An engine failure like that, 2 engines out, birds in. I would not trust any computer to figure out that the only place I can land this aircraft safely and get everybody off is on that river down there. I don't see a computer figuring that out. And that took 2 eyes, 2 pilots. That's where we're going to go. And he did it successfully. So, yeah, when people tell me that we're going to have pilotless aircraft in years to come, I usually quote that one, plus the other one out of Singapore where the Qantas 32 A380 lost everything. All their computer systems failed, in fact. And it was only because there were four highly experienced pilots on the flight deck that they were able to land safely back at Singapore. The computers were dead. So, humans are infallible. At least most of the ones I know are. And I fear that that's ultimately why we lost MH370. Those people that night, in those first 3 or 4 hours, did not perform the way they should have. And people also say, yeah, it was midnight. People were not, sorry, that doesn't gel. We live in a 24-hour world, particularly in aviation. And you've got that other example at LaGuardia Airport just a couple of weeks ago, where aircraft crashed just after midnight into the fire truck. There's only one, possibly two controllers in the control tower, and it was quite busy. Human. I'm not blaming the controller on that one. I don't think it was. I don't think it will. A proper investigation would not blame that individual controller. It's a systemic fault in a case like that one. And so many of them are systemic faults. There is a limit to what the human uh, individual is capable of doing. And that man on that occasion was under a lot of stress because he already had one aircraft in trouble. The fire trucks were heading to that aircraft. Unfortunately, they had to cross the runway with another aircraft landing. And that's where the breakdown occurred, of course. The aircraft landed and ran into the fire trucks. That's where it broke down. But the controller realized it beforehand and he was calling to the fire truck, stop, stop, stop. The fire truck didn't stop. He obviously didn't hear him. There was some communication problem. Again, not so much a human error in that case, but some sort of a technical fault or a problem that had occurred on the ground. But I don't know all the facts of that one yet. Look forward to reading that report when it comes out finally. I suspect it'll be a systemic failure. And maybe MH370 also, if ever we get to the bottom of it, will also be a systemic failure. Because everything that happened at the point of transfer from Kuala Lumpur to Ho Chi Minh City, I mean, people also, you've also read the same theories from certain people and commentators that he chose his moment to disappear right at that point when he was making the transfer. Again, I don't accept that because of what we said earlier. He wasn't going to disappear if the system had worked correctly. The Vietnamese controller would have been looking for him within 2 minutes if he had done his job properly. The Kuala Lumpur controller would have been looking for him as well because he would have seen the data block disappear from his radar screen and said, what's happened here? But he went home because it was the end of his shift. The new guy came on and he didn't even know about it. So, we've got systemic failures here which need to be cleaned up and tidied up. And they could cause similar events to happen again. But it's, yeah, it's a mystery, my friend.
It
And
is.
I simply think that our systems improve. There's a lot of effort is put into improving air safety, and that will continue forever and ever.
Wow. Captain Ross, before we end this, I would like to share with our audience the two papers that you wrote. So to our audience, these publications are in the description. Feel free to download them. This is Captain Ross's key insights on MH370 on its 10th anniversary, which is part one and part two. This has been properly put down in a document for you to download. And the second one is MH370 Truth versus Theory article that was by Captain Ross in the Aviation Business in the July and August edition of 2016. Uh, And thank you, Captain Ross, for giving us the permission to share these articles so people can actually read. And it indeed is a mystery. And as you said, if it's not about when, it's about if we will get to the bottom of this, that's a big if, you know, and that's the most intriguing part of this entire mystery, the puzzle, and the suffering of the family members. Like my heart goes out to them. It's a sincere, it's a tragedy that should have not been handled the way it has been handled over the last 12 years.
Absolutely. The I said a few times back then that when people said we'll hopefully we'll find the answer to all of this, and I did say a couple of times, well, we'd never find Amelia Earhart, and she'd been missing for a long time. But in fact, we have now found her. They now have clear evidence and DNA samples and all the rest of a landing on. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of the island, but in the Pacific. And we now have a very viable story of how Amelia Earhart and her co-pilot or navigator died. They've even found a piece of wreckage which seems to qualify that the aircraft they were flying did end up in that off a reef. So, having said that, I can no longer say, well, we never found Amelia Earhart, because we have, and I would no longer say that we won't find MH370, because I think we will sooner or later,
Uh,
but not where they're
okay,
looking.
yeah.
I don't think they'll find it where they're looking.
Wow. Well, I would like our audience to please share this episode if this conversation moved you, because in the world of fleeting digital noise, our collective attention is the only thing that keeps the search for the truth alive. And by listening, you ensure this story and the 239 souls it represents are never truly lost to the deep. Captain Ross, this has been quite a fascinating conversation. You've been so busy. We've been trying to sort this out over the last month or two. I would like to thank you for your tireless advocacy, your decades of service to the skies, and also for sharing your unique and unfiltered perspective with us all today.
Thank you very much, Sid. Much appreciated, and enjoyed having the chat. You must let me know if you get any comments.
Definitely, definitely. Thank you so much, Captain Ross, for your time, and it was once again a pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye bye.